She was left in a wedding dress, abandoned and broken, until a single dad and his daughter changed everything. This isn't just a love story. It's about falling, fighting, and finding yourself when the world says, "You're done." Who is Ava? And how did she rise from heartbreak to become a miracle in motion? Where are you watching from? Tell us below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story that just might change your life. Eli Parker gripped the wheel of his rusted-out Chevy pickup with one hand and reached over to adjust the rearview mirror with the other. His dark brown eyes flicked to the reflection of his daughter, Mia, sprawled out in the back seat with her sketch pad balanced on her knees and her bare feet resting against the window. A breeze swept in through the open windows, pulling strands of her wild, curly hair into the sunlight, turning them gold. She hummed softly as her pencil moved across the page, utterly content in the moment. Eli smiled, just barely. But the old truck rumbled down a winding coastal road that snaked alongside cliffs and rolling hills blanketed in golden grass. It had been years since he'd driven this far up the coast, let alone taken time off work. The garage back home practically ran on his back and calloused hands. But Mia had asked for a weekend adventure. She wanted to draw cliffs, smell salt in the air, and sleep under the stars. Just like the books, she said, and for once, Eli said yes, without thinking too hard about the reasons he usually said no. The road curved again, and that's when he saw it. Champo Chap. It sat just off the road, perched at the edge of a bluff like it had grown there. Whitewashed and weathered by the sea, it had once been a popular wedding spot. Quaint, picturesque, with wild roses crawling up its stone steps and a bell that rang loud enough to startle seagulls from the cliffs. But the bell was silent now. There were no ribbons, no guests, no music. Just her. At first, Eli thought she was a statue, or some forgotten mannequin left over from an old bridal photo shoot. But then she moved. A woman in a wedding gown, real silk, not the fake stuff, sat slumped in a wheelchair, her veil tangled in the wind, a bouquet of crumpled white roses in her lap. Her face was hidden in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Even from the road, Eli could tell. She was crying. No, not crying. Breaking. "Daddy," Mia whispered from the back seat, having followed his gaze. "We should stop." Eli kept driving. He didn't mean to. It was instinct. Keep moving, stay out of it, don't get involved in someone else's disaster. God knows they had enough of their own. But just as the chapel disappeared in the side mirror, Mia spoke again, this time quieter, firmer. "She looks like someone who needs us." And that somehow was enough. Eli pulled over with a sigh, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Mia was already unbuckled before the truck had come to a complete stop, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. Eli climbed out slowly, stretching his back and squinting into the salty sunlight. He didn't recognize her at first, but as they approached, as the distance shrank and her features sharpened under the shadow of the church, his heart stopped cold in his chest. Ava. She was older, of course. Her hair was darker, longer, tucked into a low twist that had come half undone. Her makeup was smudged, but her eyes, those eyes were exactly the same. Piercing. Wide. Like she was always listening to something just out of reach. He hadn't seen her in nearly 15 years. "Ava," he said before he could stop himself. She looked up. For a moment, silence hovered between them. She blinked, confusion flickering across her face, then recognition. Her lips parted. Her breath caught. The wind died down. like it was waiting to hear what came next. "Lee?" she said, her voice cracked and husky. Mia stood a step behind him, looking between them like she had stumbled into the middle of a movie she didn't understand. I didn't expect," Ava started, but her voice broke again. "I didn't know it was you," Eli said, stepping closer, careful not to spook her like she was some fragile deer he might scare away. Ava gave a half laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Nobody knows. Not anymore." "What happened?" he asked gently, crouching beside her. She shook her head, tears still streaming. "He left. The wedding was supposed to be today, and he just left. Said he couldn't do it." Eli swallowed hard. "Because of the chair?" Ava looked down at her lap. "Because of me." Mia stepped forward suddenly, pressing a folded drawing into Ava's hand. "You look really pretty, even if you're sad." Ava stared at the child for a long, stunned moment. Then she smiled, just a little, and let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said, almost in a whisper. Eli straightened, heart pounding. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just bad timing or some weird roadside detour. This was something else, something bigger. He had loved her once, really loved her, before the accident, before life pulled them in opposite directions. He'd gone to trade school, she'd gone on tour with her violin. He'd worked overtime to support his pregnant wife. She'd played to audiences in Vienna. Their worlds had split, and now, somehow, they'd collided again, in the most impossible place. "We're staying nearby," he said before he could talk himself out of it. "Just a little cottage rental down the road. You want to come? Eat something? Get out of this wind?" Ava looked at him, then at Mia, then back at him. "I don't want to ruin your day." "You're not ruining anything," Eli said. "We've got leftover mac and cheese and too many granola bars. Come on." Mia held out her hand. Ava hesitated, then took it. They helped her into the truck, bouquet and all. She fit awkwardly in the passenger seat, trying to smooth the creases from her gown, wiping mascara from her cheeks with the corner of her veil. Mia chatted the whole ride back, showing Ava her sketchbook, pointing out every bird she saw, every tree that looked like a dancer. Eli didn't say much. He couldn't. His brain was working overtime just trying to make sense of this new reality. Ava Monroe, the girl who once played love songs for him on her violin in the college courtyard, was sitting next to him again, in a wedding dress, abandoned and aching. And he was bringing her home. Later that evening, they sat on the porch of the cottage, a breeze tugging at the wind chimes overhead. Mia curled up in a hammock with a coloring book. Eli handed Ava a mug of hot tea. "Thanks," she murmured, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "For everything. I didn't know who else to call." "You didn't call," he said quietly. "You didn't have to." They sat in silence for a few beats. The sun dipped low over the ocean, painting the sky with fire. "What happened, Ava?" he asked again, softer this time. She didn't look at him when she answered. "We met 3 years ago, Nathan. He was charming, confident. He made me feel like I wasn't broken, until I was." Eli waited. "He proposed last fall, told me he loved me, that he didn't care about the chair or the scars or any of it. But this morning, he told me he didn't want a life where he had to pretend I was enough." Eli clenched his jaw. "What a coward." She nodded, staring down at her tea. Maybe. Or maybe he just told the truth, too late. No, Eli said. The truth is, you deserve better. A hell of a lot better. She looked at him then, eyes rimmed with salt. You're different, she said. Older, wiser, worn out, he added with a soft chuckle. Life will do that to you. They both laughed a little. It wasn't happy laughter, but it wasn't bitter either. It was shared. As the stars began to come out, Ava looked over at Mia. She's special, she said. She saved me, Eli said simply. After Rachel died, I didn't think I'd be okay again. But Mia, she gave me a reason to show up. Ava nodded, letting the words sink into her bones. She reminds me of who I used to be. Eli turned to her. Maybe that part of you's still in there. She didn't answer, but for the first time in hours her eyes softened, not with sorrow, but with something gentler. Hope. A tiny ember. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning of a new one. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the cottage, casting delicate shadows on the hardwood floor. Eli stirred his coffee in the tiny kitchen, watching the steam curl into the air. Behind him, he heard Mia humming, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, as she padded into the room and climbed onto one of the bar stools, dragging her sketchpad along like a favorite stuffed animal. Her eyes were bright, like always, but softer now. Thoughtful, she glanced toward the guest room. She's still sleeping, she said quietly. Eli nodded. She's had a rough couple days. Mia tilted her head. Do you think she's going to be okay? He paused before answering. I think she's stronger than she knows. Truth be told, he didn't know what to expect when Ava wheeled into their lives like a ghost from another lifetime. The night before, she'd seemed fragile, like a snowflake balancing on a wire. Beautiful, but always one gust from disappearing. Yet something had shifted, even in just a few hours. He saw it in the way she looked at Mia, in the way her fingers trembled a little less when she drank her tea. Maybe she didn't believe it yet, but Eli could feel it, like a melody just beneath the noise. She was still in there. The Ava he'd once loved. Maybe different, maybe dented, but not gone. An hour later, she rolled out from the guest room, still in that wrinkled wedding gown, now paired with one of Mia's hoodies. The sleeves were comically short, but she wore it like armor, zipped halfway with the hood resting on her shoulders. Her eyes were clearer. Her face, though tired, had a trace of color. "Morning," she said, offering a faint smile. Eli handed her a mug. "Morning. Hope you don't mind peppermint?" "I'll survive," she said, taking it gratefully. Mia hopped off her stool. "Do you want to come to the beach with us? There's tide pools and sometimes crabs, and once I saw a jellyfish the size of a dinner plate." Ava hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Maybe later, sweetheart. I think I need some air first." "Alone air." Mia nodded solemnly. "I get that." Eli watched as Ava rolled out onto the porch. She sat there for a long time, sipping her tea, staring out at the waves crashing quietly against the cliffs. He wanted to say something, anything, but instead he gave her space, knowing sometimes silence spoke better than words. When she finally came back inside, the sunlight behind her painted her silhouette like a halo. She looked at him, eyes heavy but alert. "Can we talk?" He nodded, setting his mug down. They went outside again, down the short ramp to the side of the house that led to a bench facing the ocean. She parked her chair beside it while he sat, elbows on his knees, looking out. "You remember that night at Hartley Hall?" she asked after a while. "The one with the thunderstorm?" Eli chuckled. "How could I forget? You played Debussy by candlelight, and I thought, well, hell, this is it. This is the moment I fall." "You did fall," she said, a playful note in her voice. "Off the damn windowsill. Right into your cello case." Anna laughed, and it was like music. Short, bright, a bit broken, but alive. Then her voice softened. "That was the night I knew I couldn't marry you." The words hit him like a slap he didn't expect, even if they came with no malice. He turned slowly. "You left before I even knew you were gone." "I didn't leave you because I stopped loving you," she said quickly, urgently. "I left because I loved you too much, and I knew, if I stayed, you'd give up everything. Your apprenticeship, your family business, your town. You would have followed me across oceans. You would have shrunk yourself for my spotlight. You didn't give me a choice," Eli said, not angrily, just truthfully. Eva looked down. "I thought I was protecting you, and maybe I was protecting myself, too. I was scared of what it meant, to be that important to someone. And now," she exhaled, shaky. "Now I think maybe I didn't really understand what love was back then. I thought it was fireworks, big music, grand gestures. But last night, watching Mia fall asleep with her head on your shoulder, with her crayon-smudged fingers still holding my hand, that felt like love, not the performance kind, the kind that stays." He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he looked out over the cliffs, watching the gulls wheel and dive in the sky. "Rachel was different," he finally said. "We were good together, simple, steady. But I never stopped wondering about you, even when I hated myself for it." Ava nodded, tears quietly collecting along her lashes. "I used to look you up, when it got hard, when the music stopped. You went quiet online after she passed. I didn't know how to be someone again after that," he admitted. "Everything became about Mia. She kept me standing." "She's special," Ava said. "Smart, brave. She gets it from her mom." They sat quietly for a while, then Ava shifted in her chair. "There's more I need to tell you about Nathan." Eli's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "We met at a benefit concert. He was charming, confident, said all the right things. I wasn't looking for love. I'd already decided that part of me was done. But he didn't see the chair at first, or he pretended not to." She swallowed hard. "It wasn't until I agreed to marry him that he changed. Subtle at first. Jokes, questions, little shames. Why I wore certain clothes, why I hadn't tried harder to walk again. And I thought I owed him something. For choosing me." Eli's fists clenched slowly, but he didn't interrupt. "He found out about the inheritance last year. My grandmother's estate. Suddenly, the wedding planning got urgent. Contracts, prenups. And yesterday, he told me he didn't want to marry someone who needed accommodation. Said love was supposed to feel like freedom, and being with me felt like a trap." Eli stood up. He couldn't help it. The rage surged like a storm tide in his chest. "That to you?" he said, voice sharp. Ava flinched but nodded. "He's a coward," Eli muttered. "Worse than that. A fraud. I'm not telling you this for pity, she said quickly. I need you to know. I'm not coming here as someone hoping to be rescued. I just didn't know where else to go that didn't already feel like a cage. Eli knelt in front of her. Not to patronize, not to soothe, but to meet her eyes. You're not a burden, he said. You never were. Not then. Not now. A tear slid down her cheek, and she let it fall. I don't know how to do this anymore, she admitted. How to be seen. Start small, he said. Let someone see you who already knows how beautiful you are. A breeze picked up, rustling the hem of her borrowed hoodie. Behind them, Mia's laughter echoed from the hill above the cottage. She was playing a game with herself, chasing invisible fairies or clouds, or maybe just happiness. I think I'd like to stay a little while, Ava said. Eli smiled. We've got room. And a piano, she added. I saw it in the living room. Been out of tune for years. So have I, she said. But maybe we can fix that. They sat together in the wind, not holding hands, not wrapped in some romantic haze, just being. The way people who once shattered each other find themselves quietly rebuilt, not perfect, but present. That evening, Ava wheeled herself inside and found the piano in the corner, covered in dust and old sheet music. Mia watched from the couch as Ava pressed one key, then another. The notes were wrong, too high, too low, but she kept going. Eventually, a tune emerged, familiar, halting. Eli leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, heart aching in a good way. He knew that melody. She'd written it in college. For him. But she'd never finished it. Now, years later, she played the rest. The cottage smelled like cinnamon toast and old wood the next morning, the kind of scent that curled into your chest and settled there like a memory you forgot you missed. Mia was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, sorting seashells into categories: pink, shiny, weird, and definitely haunted. Ava watched her from the couch, coffee in one hand, legs tucked neatly beneath a quilt she insisted she didn't need, but had pulled around herself anyway. Eli was in the kitchen, humming low under his breath as he flipped pancakes on a griddle that had seen better days. He wasn't a great cook, never claimed to be, but he could handle breakfast. The clatter of a fork against the counter made him glance up, and he caught Ava watching him through the open doorway. She didn't look away this time. She smiled. Small, tired, but real, and he smiled back before returning to the task at hand. Suddenly more aware of his posture than he'd been in years. You're weirdly good at that, Ava called after a moment. Want breakfast? No, the dad thing. He chuckled. Only took 9 years of crash courses and catastrophic learning curves. The pancakes, though, I nailed those by month 4. Impressive. Don't ask about my attempt at lasagna, he added, flipping another golden circle onto the growing stack. That was a war crime. She laughed, and the sound, just like the night before, twisted something in his chest. He could have sworn it had been years since he'd heard her laugh like that. Like it didn't cost her anything. After breakfast, the three of them wandered down the narrow trail behind the cottage. It led to a stretch of private beach, the kind with soft sand and driftwood strewn like forgotten sculptures. The wind was light, the waves calm, and Mia darted ahead, leaving a trail of giggles and barefoot prints. Eli stayed close behind Ava, pushing her chair when the terrain got tricky, but mostly just walking alongside, letting her decide the pace. They didn't talk much until they reached a flat stretch of rock overlooking the ocean. There, Mia plopped down and pulled out her sketch pad again, humming something vaguely familiar as she began to draw. Eli sat a few feet away, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked out at the horizon like it held answers. Ava rolled up beside him, her arms crossed lightly over her lap. "You're quiet today," she said after a beat. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit?" "Yeah, well, I haven't had time to think in a long time." She nodded. "Music was always my noise." Then, after the accident, the silence felt like it was mocking me. He glanced at her. "I don't remember you ever being afraid of quiet." "That's because I used to fill it with sound, with motion, with plans. When all that stopped, the silence, it turned into something else." "Like what?" "Judgment," she said, then blinked like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. Eli didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, like he understood, even if he couldn't explain how. A gull screamed overhead, then vanished into the blue. Mia suddenly held up her sketch pad. Look, she had drawn the three of them, herself, Eli, and Ava, sitting on a giant shell like it was a couch, surrounded by dancing jellyfish and dolphins wearing crowns. Ava smiled. "Is that a violin in my lap?" Mia nodded. "And you're teaching me how to play underwater." "That sounds very complicated." "But it's cool," Mia said seriously. "Because you're magic. I think maybe you used to be a mermaid, and now you just forgot." Ava blinked, her lips parted, and Eli looked over just in time to see her fighting tears again. But this time, they weren't heavy, just honest. "I don't think I've ever been drawn like that," she said softly. "Well, now you have," Mia replied. "Do you know how to really play violin?" Ava looked at Eli, then back at the girl. "Yeah, I used to be pretty good. Can you show me?" Ava hesitated. "I haven't touched one in a while." "That's okay. I haven't either," Mia said, her logic unshakable. They returned to the cottage in the early afternoon. The sun hung lazily in the sky, and Mia scampered off to collect her stuffed animals for what she announced would be a concert/Gashen show. Eli followed Ava inside, and after a brief pause disappeared into the back of the garage. Ava sat near the front window, watching gulls dip and spin over the water, her fingers twitching as if they remembered something her heart had tried to forget. She was so lost in thought, she didn't hear Eli come back until he gently set something on the table beside her. It was an old violin case. The leather was scuffed, the handle wrapped in duct tape. But the gold latches still gleamed faintly in the light. She stared at it. "I found it a few years ago," he said. "Storage box I'd never unpacked. I think it's yours." Her fingers moved toward it like magnets. She flipped the latches, one by one, then opened the lid. Inside was a violin. Slightly warped from time and humidity, but intact. The strings had loosened. A single sheet of music lay beneath the instrument. Handwritten. Familiar. Her own melody, the one she never finished. Ava pressed her fingers to the wood, her breath catching in her throat. "I thought it was gone," she whispered. "I never threw it out," Eli said. "Didn't know why. Just couldn't do it." She lifted the instrument slowly, reverently, like it might shatter under her touch. Her left hand curled around a neck, her right hovered near the bow, then dropped. "I don't think I can play like I used to." "You don't have to," he said. "Just let it say what it wants." She sat back, rested the violin against her shoulder, and raised the bow. Her grip was shaky, her wrist stiff. But when she drew the bow across the strings, the first note hummed low and sweet, like a memory coming home. Mia rushed in, arms full of plush toys, and stopped short when she saw Ava playing. "Is this the concert part?" she asked, awed. Ava smiled through her tears. "It is now." The melody wavered at first, but Ava adjusted her fingers and played again. Eli recognized the tune, the unfinished song from college, written in a notebook she never let anyone read. But this time it kept going. Ava played past the part where it used to break off, adding something new, something raw. The music was slower now, sadder, but deeper. Mia clutched her bear and swayed gently, eyes closed. Eli didn't move. He barely breathed. When the last note faded into the room, Ava lowered the violin and exhaled hard. "That wasn't perfect," she said, almost laughing. "It was," Eli said. "It really was." That evening, after dinner and an impromptu sea creature fashion show judged by Eli and narrated by Mia in a terrible British accent, they sat together on the back porch. The stars had started peeking out between clouds, and the world felt small, warm, and entirely theirs. Ava held the violin in her lap like a secret she was ready to tell again. "Do you think it's crazy," she asked Eli, "that after all these years, after everything, we're back here?" "No," he said. "I think it's something better than crazy." "What?" "A second verse." Ava looked at him for a long moment, then turned her eyes skyward. "I never finished that song because I was scared to end it wrong," she said quietly. Eli nodded. Maybe it just needed time. Mia dozed off in a blanket nest beside them, a half-finished sketch resting on her chest. It showed a woman in a wheelchair holding a violin, surrounded by stars that spelled out one word in crooked little letters. "Hope." Ava reached over and took Eli's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively peaceful. Morning walks to the beach, shared meals at the kitchen table, laughter echoing through the halls of the cottage like sunlight filtering through dusty windows. But underneath the quiet, a tremor was growing. It started as a whisper in the back of Ayla's mind, a tug behind his ribs whenever Ava smiled too brightly or hesitated just a second too long, when Mia asked if she was going to stay forever. It wasn't that Ava was pretending to be fine. If anything, she was remarkably honest about her struggles. But there was something she wasn't saying. Eli could feel it. He'd spent years learning how to read silences, how to listen between words. It was a skill forged in grief, sharpened by fatherhood. And right now, every instinct told him something was off. He found out what it was one afternoon when he went into town to grab groceries and a new pair of shoes for Mia, who had managed to outgrow her sandals seemingly overnight. The town of Fairhaven hadn't changed much since he last passed through. Same sleepy storefronts, same salt-stained benches, same gossip, always a few steps behind the truth. While Mia stayed with Ava to paint seashells, Eli parked outside the general store and made his way toward the bakery for a coffee. That's when he saw him. Nathan Cross. Tall, tanned, and dressed like someone who thought casual meant expensive. He was leaning against a sleek black car, sunglasses perched on his head, tapping something into his phone with the relaxed arrogance of a man who never had to clean up after himself. Eli's stomach tightened. Nathan didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in whatever nonsense he was composing on his screen. Eli could have walked away, could have ignored it, but the moment he heard Nathan laugh, really laugh, loud and smug. He turned. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," Eli said flatly. Nathan looked up, confused, then smiled slowly. "Well, look who it is. The mechanic." Eli didn't move. "What do you want?" Nathan shrugged. "Nothing you can help with. Just tying up loose ends." Eli took a step closer. "Ava's not one of your loose ends." Nathan laughed again, the sound sharp and hollow. "Please. I gave her more time than she deserved. I stuck around longer than any sane man would have. You don't know what it's like, dealing with someone like that. Always needing, always fragile." Eli's hands curled into fists. "You call leaving her at the altar dealing with it? I call it saving us both from a lifetime of resentment," Nathan said smoothly. "What, you think you're some kind of hero now? You show up, play house for a week, and suddenly she's healed?" "I'm not here to fix her," Eli growled. "She doesn't need fixing. She needs someone who doesn't run the second life gets inconvenient." Nathan's smile disappeared. "Careful, Parker. You don't know what you're walking into." "Neither do you," Ellie said, voice like ice. "Because if you ever come near her again, I promise you, you'll regret it." Nathan pushed off the car, expression hardening. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Eli said, "and you can take it however you want." He walked away before the heat behind his eyes turned into something worse. By the time he reached the truck, his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He didn't tell Ava right away. Part of him wanted to spare her, to shield her from the venom still lingering in Nathan's voice, but the other part, the honest part, knew that wasn't his call to make. That night, as the sky darkened and Mia drifted off in the hammock with a paintbrush still tucked behind her ear, Eli found Ava on the porch. She was staring at the stars again, legs covered in a blanket, violin in her lap like a sleeping pet. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. She looked up, immediately alert. "Of course." He sat beside her, the words knotting up in his chest. "I saw Nathan today." Her face didn't change much, but her fingers stiffened slightly against the wood of the instrument. "Where?" "In town, near the bakery." She didn't speak, just stared ahead. "He said he's here to tie up loose ends," Eli continued, "and I think that includes pressuring you into signing away whatever claim you have to that shared property." Ava sighed, then leaned back into her chair. "Of course he did." "Ava, I knew he'd come," she said quietly. "He's too proud to let me walk away with anything. He's been leaving messages, emails, legal letters. He offered me a settlement." "Are you considering it?" "I was," she admitted, "before I came here." Eli frowned. "And now?" "Now I'm not sure money's worth selling off pieces of my dignity." He nodded, silent approval behind his eyes. "But I also don't need a fight right now," she added, softer. "I don't have the energy for war." "I get that," Eli said. "But you don't have to fight it alone." Ava looked at him, really looked, and her expression shifted. Something between gratitude and fear flickered across her face. "You can't save me, Eli," she said. "I appreciate the instinct, but I've spent the last 2 years learning how to fight for myself. I don't want to be rescued." "I know," he said. "I don't want to rescue you. I want to stand beside you." The wind stirred the trees behind them. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then Ava whispered, "He made me feel small, like love was a favor he was doing for me." "You were never small," Eli said. "He was just too narrow to see you clearly." Her voice broke. Why didn't I leave sooner? Because you wanted to believe in him, Eli said. That's not weakness. That's hope. A tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, then laughed bitterly. I hate crying in front of people. It doesn't make you fragile, he said. It makes you real. Ava turned to him, her eyes shining. You always knew how to say the right thing. I always meant to say it back then, he replied. I just didn't know how. A long pause followed. Ava looked down at her hands. What happens now? We keep going, Eli said. We eat too many pancakes, we help Mia name every seashell on the beach, and when you're ready, you tell that piece of garbage to shove his offer somewhere he can't find it again. Ava smiled through her tears. That's a plan I could live with. He reached out and took her hand. Not to pull her up, not to lead her anywhere. Just to be there. They sat like that until the stars thickened and the crickets began to sing. Eli didn't press. He knew the storm inside her was still there, but it wasn't as loud now. She had found something steady again. A place to anchor. Not because he offered it, but because she had chosen to dock. Later, after Mia had been tucked in with a forehead kiss and a whispered story about magical oceans, Ava stood at the edge of the living room, her hand resting lightly on her wheelchair's handle. Do you ever think, she said, that the universe has a sense of humor? Eli looked up from his spot on the couch. All the time. I mean, what are the odds that I'd end up here, that you'd be here, that a little girl with seafoam paint on her elbows would be the only person in the world who looked at me like I was still whole? He stood slowly. Maybe the universe isn't laughing at us, he said. Maybe it's given us a second take. Not a second chance? She asked. He walked toward her. No, he said. A second verse. Ava reached for her violin. She didn't play that night, but she kept it close, like a promise not yet spoken. And outside the stars kept burning. Quiet. Relentless. Like they knew something neither of them had figured out yet. The next morning dawned gentle and golden, with the sky painted in soft streaks of peach and silver. The ocean was calm, the waves whispering to the shore in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Inside the cottage, Eli stirred awake to the familiar creak of the front door opening and Mia's footsteps padding across the porch. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness of the moment. As he made his way to the kitchen, he found something waiting for him on the table. A drawing. It was crayon on thick sketch paper, folded carefully in half like a letter. On the front was a picture of Ava, seated in her wheelchair under the willow tree behind the cottage, her violin in her lap and her eyes lifted to the stars. Beside her stood Eli, a hand resting gently on her shoulder, and Mia in the foreground, arms wide, her hair catching the wind. The caption, written in Mia's unmistakably loopy handwriting, read, "My family." Eli sat down slowly, his chest tightening as he opened the paper. Inside, more drawings. This time a house with flowers in the window boxes. A dog they didn't have, but Mia had clearly decided they needed. And a scene of Ava teaching Mia to play violin, complete with musical notes floating through the air. At the bottom was one simple sentence written in pink marker. I hope Ms. Ava stays forever. He was still holding it when Ava wheeled herself into the room, her hair pulled into a low braid, a gray shawl draped around her shoulders. Her face was fresh, but her eyes were tired in a way that suggested she hadn't slept much. When she saw what he was holding, she froze. I didn't know she was drawing that. she said softly. She left it for me, Eli replied. Probably wanted me to get the hint. Ava gave a small, breathless laugh, then crossed the room slowly and joined him at the table. She glanced down at the drawing again, her fingers brushing across the paper. She sees the world in such color. She does, Eli said. She paints what she wants to believe in, and she wants to believe in me. She already does, Eli said. So do I. Ava looked up at him, something raw flickering in her gaze. I don't know how to be what she thinks I am. You don't have to, he said. Just be here. There was silence between them for a moment, thick with meaning. Then Ava looked down at her hands, her voice quieter than before. I was never supposed to be a mother. That was never part of the plan. Eli leaned back. Why not? Because I didn't think I had it in me, the patience, the strength. I thought love like that belonged to people who were whole. She swallowed hard. After the accident, it wasn't even a question anymore. It became this unspoken truth. I wasn't going to build a family. I was going to survive, maybe teach, maybe play if I ever healed enough. But love, parenthood, that felt like another life's dream. Eli didn't rush to respond. He just let the silence stretch, like a blanket being gently pulled over cold shoulders. When he did speak, it was with a careful softness. You ever think that maybe life doesn't care about the plan? She looked at him, surprised by the smile tugging at his lips. You think I plan to be a single dad? He asked. To lose Rachel so early? To fumble my way through every school form and haircut and birthday party? Ava smiled faintly. You make it look easy. It's not. But Mia doesn't need me to be perfect. She just needs me to show up. Her eyes shimmered at that, and she looked away, blinking fast. She called you family, Eli said gently. I heard, Ava whispered. She meant it. Ava let out a shaky breath. That little girl is going to break my heart. Yeah, Eli said. That's what happens when you love someone. Later that afternoon, while Mia napped on the couch in a tangle of blankets and stuffed animals, Ava asked if she could sit outside alone for a while. Eli helped her onto the back deck, set up a small table with tea and her violin case, and left her with a soft, "I'm right inside," before giving her the space she needed. She sat for a long time, listening to the waves. Then she reached for the violin and gently lifted it into her lap. Her fingers found the strings, the bow light in her hand, and she began to play. Not the unfinished song, not a classical piece from memory, but something new, something soft and simple. She was still playing when Mia padded out, her hair a mess, cheeks flushed from sleep. "Hi," Mia whispered. Ava looked up and smiled. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you sad?" "A little." "Did I do something wrong?" Alva shook her head quickly. "No, not at all. You did something really beautiful." Mia stepped closer, her voice small. "You don't have to stay forever if you don't want to. I just drew it because I hoped." Ava's breath caught, her heart folding in on itself like paper. "I've never been someone's hope before," she said. Mia reached for her hand. "Daddy says you don't have to be perfect to be part of the story." Ava squeezed her fingers gently. "He's right." "Can I ask you something?" Mia asked. "Of course. Do you want to be my music teacher?" Ava blinked. "You really want to learn?" "I really want to learn from you." And just like that, something shifted again. The wall inside her, built from years of rejection and fear, cracked open just wide enough to let in a little light. "I'd love to," Ava said. That evening, they turned the living room into a makeshift music studio. Eli moved the furniture to one side, Mia dragged in a stool, and Ava sat up near the window, where the last rays of sunset painted everything in gold. The lesson wasn't long. Just posture, how to hold the bow, where to place fingers. But Mia soaked up every word, nodding with wide, eager eyes. Eli watched from the hallway, arms crossed, heart full. Ava wasn't just teaching. She was glowing. Every movement, every correction, every gentle encouragement, it was like watching a bird remember how to fly. Later, after Mia had gone to bed with dreams of duets and concert halls, Ava wheeled herself out to the porch again. Eli joined her without a word, handing her a mug of chamomile tea and sitting beside her in the quiet. "She's special," Ava said. "She is. And scared." "Of what?" "That I'm going to love her too much, and that one day she'll look at me and realize I don't belong in the picture she drew." Eli turned to her. "She already knows what you look like. She knows the chair, the scars. She still put you in her family. I don't want to disappoint her." "You won't," he said. "You couldn't." They sat together for a while, watching the stars blink into existence. "Really?" she asked softly. "Yeah. If I said yes to all of it, to staying, to trying, would that be okay?" He looked at her, no hesitation in his voice. "It would be more than okay. It would be everything." Ava didn't cry, not this time. This time she simply smiled, real and full, and reached for his hand. And in that moment, with the ocean whispering nearby and the scent of summer lilacs on the breeze, Eli knew that the drawing Mia had left on the table that morning wasn't a wish. It was a glimpse of the future, and they were already stepping into it. The morning began like any other, quiet and full of promise. The sky stretched open in soft blues and oranges, the waves lapping at the shore with rhythmic patience. Birds chirped lazily in the distance as Eli sipped his coffee on the porch, the mug warm in his hands. Inside the cottage, he could hear the soft thud of Mia hopping off the couch, her socked feet hitting the wood floor with their usual chaotic glee. He smiled to himself. There was something healing in this new rhythm they'd all found together. Unexpected, imperfect, but deeply good. Then he heard it. A crash. Not loud, but wrong. Followed by silence. Eli froze. A second later, Mia's voice rang out, panicked and sharp. "Daddy, come quick." He was already moving before the mug hit the porch railing, feet pounding through the front door and down the hallway. The sound had come from the back garden, the space Ava had begun to use more and more for her walking exercises. Just last night, she'd made it halfway to the edge of the clearing without needing to stop. But now she lay crumpled in the grass, her wheelchair tipped on its side, one hand still clenched around the cane that had betrayed her. "Ava," Eli breathed, rushing to her side. Mia knelt beside her, wide-eyed and trembling. Ava didn't look up. "I'm fine," she muttered. Eli crouched, his hands hovering, careful not to touch her until she gave him permission. "Did you hit your head?" "No, just my pride. Let me help you up." "No." Her voice was sharp now, brittle. "I said I'm fine." But she wasn't. He could see it in her clenched jaw, the way her breath stuttered in her chest, the way her arms shook as she tried to push herself upright. Eli didn't argue. He simply knelt beside her, patient and steady. Together, they got her back into the chair. She winced as she adjusted her legs, one arm draped across her lap like it was made of glass. Mia stood back, clutching the edge of her t-shirt, her bottom lip trembling. "I'm sorry," Ava said suddenly. "I didn't mean to scare her." "She's okay," Eli replied. "You're okay." But she wasn't. And later, after a quiet dinner she barely touched, and a soft good night to Mia that felt forced, Ava closed her bedroom door and didn't come out for the rest of the evening. Eli stood outside that door for a long time, his knuckles hovering above the wood. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, to tell her falling didn't mean failing. But he knew her too well. Words right now would feel like salt. Instead, he whispered, "I left a plate in the kitchen, just in case," and walked away. The next morning, the sun rose without her. The wheelchair sat untouched near the door. The cane leaned uselessly against the hallway wall. The only movement from her room was the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional rustle of bed sheets. Eli knocked once. No answer. He didn't push. Mia, sensing the shift, grew quieter. She didn't ask questions, didn't press, but her drawings changed. Gone were the vibrant colors and swirling violins. Now she drew gray shapes, storm clouds, an empty wheelchair beneath a tree with no leaves. By the third day, Eli called Dr. Blaine. The physical therapist's voice was calm but concerned. "It's not uncommon," she explained. "The first fall after progress, it can undo a month's worth of confidence. She's probably questioning everything. Her body, her worth. She won't talk to me. She might not be ready yet," Blaine said. "But she's still listening. Leave the door open." That night, Eli sat outside her room again. This time, he brought something with him, a stack of old envelopes, yellowed and fraying, tied together with a bit of string. He sat with his back to the door and began to read aloud. "Dear Ava," he began, "I thought today would be easier. It's not." Inside the room, Ava lay on her side, eyes fixed on the shadows that danced across her ceiling. She knew that voice, and she knew those words. Eli kept going. "I still reach across the bed like you might be there. I still hear your laugh in songs. Leo asked me last week if I'd ever had a broken heart. I said yes. I told him your name." Her eyes stung. She pressed her fingers to her lips to hold back the sound that threatened to escape. "I wrote one of these every year," Eli said. "Even after I married Rachel. Even after she passed. Every year I told myself I was letting go. But every letter ended the same way. Still yours, Eli." Silence fell, and then she cried. Not the quiet, dignified kind, but the aching, shoulder-shaking sobs of someone who had tried so hard to hold everything together for too long. When she finally opened the door the next morning, she looked like someone who had walked through fire. Her eyes were red, her cheeks hollow, but her spine was straight. She rolled into the living room slowly and found Eli sitting at the dining table, sipping his coffee with the weariness of someone who hadn't slept either. He looked up. "Hi," she said. "Hi. I think I'd like to try again." He stood without hesitation. "I'll be right here." She nodded. "Maybe not the whole path this time, On steps enough. They didn't need more words. Out in the garden, the air smelled like damp earth and new beginnings. The grass still held dew, and the sun hadn't fully burned away the morning mist. Ava stood slowly, her legs shaky but willing. She gripped the cane, took a breath, and stepped forward. One foot, then the other. Eli stayed close, his hands never touching unless she reached first. When she stopped, breath catching, he offered her his arm. Not to pull her, not to guide her, but to lean against if she chose. She didn't speak until they reached the first stone. "I walked," she whispered. "You did." She looked up at him, her voice raw but steady. "I was so sure I couldn't, that the fall proved I was done. It proved you were still trying." She laughed, tired, shaky, but real. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch, lemonade sweating in glasses, the world slowly unfolding around them again. Mia brought out a new drawing, this time of Ava mid-step, cane in hand, stars behind her. "I knew you'd try again," she said. Ava smiled. "You were right." That night, Eli found her in the living room, staring out at the moonlit garden. She didn't turn when he entered. "I keep thinking," she said softly, "what if I'd never tried again?" He didn't answer right away. "Then I would have married you anyway," he said finally. "And I would have loved you just the same." She turned, tears welling again. "Even if I never walked another step?" He crossed the room, knelt beside her, and took her hand gently in his. "Especially then," he said. "Because love isn't about standing tall. It's about standing beside each other when everything feels like it's falling apart." Ava closed her eyes and exhaled. Long and slow. "I'm not chasing what I used to be," she whispered. "I think I'm building something new." Eli pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "That," he said, "is the only kind of miracle worth having." The wind carried the scent of salt and sun-dried seaweed as Ava sat on the porch of the cottage, bundled in a soft gray sweater. Her fingers rested gently around a ceramic mug, the tea inside now lukewarm but untouched. She stared out toward the garden path, where the grass was uneven and flecked with tiny wildflowers, and further out, where the pond mirrored the soft blue morning sky. Her eyes followed the gentle movements of the willow tree at the edge of the clearing, its long branches swaying like dancers that remembered every step. Eli stood nearby, holding 2 mugs, one for himself, one for her, though he knew she wouldn't drink another until she finished her thoughts. He didn't push. He had learned, slowly and with practice, how to wait for her rhythm instead of rushing it. Mia sat farther out by the pond, crouched in the grass with a notebook open in her lap, tongue pressed between her lips in concentration, as she sketched the ducks she had named like royalty: Duchess Waddle, Sir Quackalot, and their scandalous cousin, Queen Sassafras. Ava glanced up at Eli as he walked over and handed her the mug. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. "Still 2 sugars and a splash of cream," he said. "You remember?" she said, quietly amused. "I never forget the important things." They sat in silence, the kind that stretched but didn't press, until Mia bounded over, holding up the notebook like a trophy. "Miss Ava," she declared, "they're all here today. Want to help me name the new one?" Ava arched a brow. "A new one?" Mia nodded seriously. "He has a limp. I think he might be an undercover goose." Ava laughed, a warm, open sound that caught Eli by surprise. "Let me see," she said, taking the notebook. The sketch was crude but filled with character. The limp-foot duck was smaller than the others, with wide eyes and what Mia had attempted to draw as a detective's hat. "I think," Ava said thoughtfully, "we should name him Inspector Wiggle." Mia gasped. "That's perfect." Eli leaned against the porch railing, watching the two of them with a look that softened every line in his weathered face. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when Ava had become not just part of their lives, but woven into them. It hadn't been marked by a single moment, but rather by 1,000 quiet ones. A glance, a shared laugh, a sketch, a cup of tea. Later that afternoon, as the sun warmed the backs of their necks and the breeze lifted the edges of the notebook pages, Ava rolled her chair into the garden with Leo and declared, "All right, Captain of Ducks, let's dance." They began slowly, arms up, wrists soft, painting invisible shapes into the air. Mia copied her movements with a mixture of seriousness and joy, her bare feet lifting off the ground as if pulled by strings of imagination. Ava didn't dance in the way she once had, but her spirit moved with precision and grace. Her voice took on the lilt of an instructor, guiding, encouraging, adapting. "Let the wind move through your fingertips," she told Mia. "Don't fight it, move with it." Eli watched from the porch, spellbound. There was something in the way Ava taught, something quiet and strong. It wasn't just about dance, it was about reclaiming space, about returning to a part of herself she'd once believed was lost forever. When the lesson ended, they all lay on a picnic blanket beneath the willow tree, drinking lemonade and nibbling on peanut butter sandwiches that were half crust, half chaos. "Do you miss dancing?" Mia asked quietly. Ava didn't hesitate. "Every day. Do you think you'll do it again?" Ava glanced toward the sky, where the clouds drifted lazily like they had nowhere to be. "Not the way I used to," she said. "But maybe, in new ways." Mia nodded solemnly. "I think you could teach again. You're really good." Ava smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way up to her eyes. "You're kind." "I'm honest," Mia said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Daddy says so." Eli chuckled. She once told a pastor his sermon was too long and used too many complicated God words. Ava laughed, a rich sound that filled the air. "You're raising a truth-teller." Eli looked at his daughter, then back at Ava. "She's teaching me more than I ever expected." The light began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the grass. Ava turned toward the pond, her expression pensive. "Today was good," she said softly. "It was," Eli agreed. "I didn't expect that. After the fall, I thought I'd be a wreck. But today felt like something else. Something real." "You're allowed to be a wreck," he said, "but that doesn't mean you can't be something more, too." She looked at him, eyes searching. "But you still see me, don't you? Even like this." He didn't flinch. "I never stopped." The next morning, Ava returned to the pond with her cane instead of her chair. She moved slowly, carefully, but she moved. Eli and Mia were already there. Eli with 2 mugs of coffee, Mia with a sketchbook half full of ducks doing ballet. "Working on a children's book?" Ava teased. Mia beamed. "Maybe, but only if you help me make the ducks dance." They spent the morning beneath the willow, Ava teaching Mia the basics: posture, balance, how to hold tension in your fingertips but not your heart. "Feel the space around you," Ava said, her voice gentle. Let it move with you, not against you. Eli watched from a few feet away, coffee cooling in his hands. Something had changed in Ava. Her shoulders had relaxed. Her laugh came easier. Her movements were no longer hesitant, but intentional. She wasn't performing. She was becoming. That evening, after dinner and a spirited debate over the merits of too much frosting on cupcakes, they sat on the porch, the sky melting into a velvet dusk. Ava looked at Eli. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For today. For not giving up on me when I couldn't believe in myself." He set down his mug, pulled a chair closer to hers. "You made today happen," he said. "Not me." She looked down at her hands, her voice soft. "I thought I'd buried that part of me, the dancer, the teacher. After the accident, I locked the door and threw away the key." He leaned forward, but it was still there, waiting. "Maybe," she whispered, "but I was afraid. What if I couldn't give it everything anymore? What if trying just reminded me of what I lost?" "Not everything beautiful has to be perfect," he said. "Sometimes it's the trying that brings it back to life." Her eyes filled, the tears bright and unhidden this time. Later, as the porch lights blinked on and Mia yawned into her sketchpad, she brought it over to Ava. "I drew you," she announced. Ava opened the page. It was her. Beneath the willow, arms lifted in graceful arcs, eyes shining. Above the drawing, Mia had written in big, looping letters, "Miss Ava dances with her heart." Ava hugged her close, one arm wrapped tight around the little girl's shoulders. "You have no idea," she whispered, "how much this means to me." Mia looked up. "Can we keep dancing tomorrow?" Ava smiled through tears. "Yes, sweetheart, tomorrow. And the day after that." And just like that, the future opened a little wider. Not perfectly, but beautifully. A year passed the way the tide shifts, slowly, then all at once. The yard was alive with the kind of joy that buzzed in the late spring air, when the grass was thick and forgiving and the sun cast golden ribbons through the trees. Strings of white paper lanterns hung between the branches, swaying gently in the breeze like soft stars come early. Wildflowers, hand-picked by Mia, filled mason jars lining the footpath. A small table held lemonade, cupcakes, and a chocolate cake topped with a slightly lopsided sugar duck, which Mia insisted on naming Lord Sprinkleton. And in the heart of it all stood Ava, on her own 2 feet. She wasn't alone, of course. Her cane stood beside her like a quiet partner, a symbol of everything she had earned with each shaky, stubborn step. She wore a dress the color of sunrise, soft and flowing, stitched not to impress but to celebrate. There were still days where her body ached, still nights when old doubts stirred beneath her ribs. But today was not one of them. Today she felt steady, whole. Eli stood near the arbor they'd built together, with far too many bent nails and endless swearing, though Mia proudly called it a magical arch of forever. His hands were tucked into the pockets of a charcoal vest, his smile small but deeply rooted, the kind that said he wasn't surprised to see her here, because some part of him had always known she would make it. "Ready?" Joan, the innkeeper, turned event planner, whispered as she adjusted the wildflower pin in Ava's hair. Ava looked ahead. She didn't need to search for courage anymore. It was already within her. "I've been ready my whole life," she said softly. "I just didn't know it. There'd been no pressure to do this again, They'd already exchanged vows under the willow tree almost a year ago, with Mia officiating and ducks quacking in the background. That moment had felt sacred in its imperfection, a quiet recommitment between two people who had known pain and still chosen each other. But a few weeks ago, Mia came to breakfast clutching a crumpled piece of construction paper. "I think we should do it again," she said, "but this time with real cake. And dancing, the kind where everyone's allowed to be a little wobbly." Eli had looked at Ava with a smile tugging at his lips. "What do you think?" Ava placed her hand over his. "Let's show the world what forever looks like when it gets a second chance." And so, on this warm afternoon, Mia, dressed in a pale blue dress 2 sizes too big and a bow in her curls, stepped forward and extended her hand. "Shall we, Mom?" Ava didn't blink at the title. She simply took the offered hand, her grip steady. Together they walked, not down an aisle, but a path. Not toward a new life, but deeper into the one they had already begun building. Past their small circle of guests, Joan, a handful of friends from the community center, a young girl in a wheelchair who now took Ava's weekly class, and the local violinist who had volunteered to play their song. Past the arbor wrapped in ribbon and paper lanterns, past the ghosts of who they had been. When they reached Ely, Ava looked up at him, eyes shining not with nerves, but with something bigger. Joy. Full, radiant joy. "I thought about what I'd say this time," she began, her voice sure, "but nothing seemed big enough. So I'll just say this. I love who I am with you, and I love who I've become, because you believed I still had more life in me." Eli took her hands, the sun warming their skin. "You didn't need to become anyone new," he replied. "I just waited for you to come home to yourself, and I promise to keep making space for you to keep becoming." Mia stepped between them, holding out a pair of rings tied together with a blue ribbon. "These ones are for the future," she said, "because the old ones were for healing." Ava slid a new band onto Eli's finger. Simple, silver, inscribed inside with the words, "Still here." He placed one on her hand, its twin inscriptions, and always. There was no applause, no formal pronouncement, just Mia whispering, "You may now dance like nobody's watching." And so they did. Under the soft wash of violin music, Ava stepped into the center of the lawn, cane in one hand, Eli's hand in the other. Her movements were slow but unshaken, each step deliberate, not to prove anything, but to celebrate everything. The music wasn't grand, but it was hers. An old song she once choreographed but never got to perform. Now she danced to it, not as the girl who once dreamed of the stage, but as the woman who had built her stage beneath a tree, beside a pond, with wildflowers and second chances all around her. Eli moved with her, careful and fluid, the way someone moves when they know the steps don't matter as much as the connection. Mia joined a few moments later, twirling clumsily but joyfully, her laughter spilling into the open air. One by one, others followed. Parents and children, dancers and non-dancers, a young girl in a wheelchair spinning in wide, joyous arcs. The lawn became a celebration not just of Ava and Eli, but of movement, of survival, of community. It wasn't a performance. It was a resurrection. As twilight fell and the fireflies returned to the garden like tiny lanterns, the three of them sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a shared blanket. The air smelled of grass and sugar and something softer. something like peace. "Do you think this is it?" Ava asked, her head resting lightly on Eli's shoulder. "The miracle?" Eli looked out at the glowing lanterns, at the guests dancing barefoot in the grass. "No," he said softly. "This was never about just one miracle." Mia leaned into them both, her voice sleepy but sure. "It's about all the little ones, strung together." That night, after the last lantern was packed away and Mia had fallen asleep on the couch with frosting on her cheek, Ava stood at the window, looking out at the yard. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, she simply whispered to her reflection, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Not to Eli, not to Mia, to herself. Some weddings never were. Some never stopped being. The next day, she returned to the community center, the same one she once rolled past, pretending not to care. This time, she walked in, cane in hand, legs steady, heart full. The room smelled like old wood and sunshine. A small group of children waited with their parents, shifting nervously, clutching water bottles in excitement. Some stood, some sat in wheelchairs, some leaned on braces or walkers. All of them wore that uncertain expression Ava knew so well. "Will I belong here?" She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I'm Ava Callahan. I used to be a dancer. Then, for a long time, I wasn't sure I could be one again." She paused, meeting each pair of wide eyes. "But someone reminded me that dancing isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up with whatever you've got and choosing to move anyway." The room stayed quiet for a beat, until a little girl in a purple wheelchair clapped. Once, then twice. The rest followed. And just like that, the class began. Later, sitting on the steps outside the center, sipping water, her legs tired but alive, Ava looked out at the world and smiled. She wasn't the same woman who had once wept in a wedding dress outside a chapel. She wasn't the frightened soul who thought her story had ended the moment she fell. She was someone who had stood back up, someone who had danced again, someone who had loved and been loved, without condition. And maybe most importantly of all, she had become her own miracle. Thank you, truly, for staying until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means your heart was listening, and that matters more than you know. Ava's journey reminds us that healing isn't linear, that even when we fall, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, we're never beyond the reach of love, or hope, or a second beginning. It's not about walking perfectly. It's about showing up, scars and all, and choosing to try again. You are not broken, you are becoming. And that is a beautiful, powerful thing. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and say hello. This community is growing across oceans and borders, and it's an honor to have you be part of it. And if this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of love, resilience, and real-life miracles. Until next time, take care of your heart, and remember, it's never too late to begin again.